So, in light of recent events, I'm going over all the times that someone seriously entertained the idea of dissolving Marines. But I want to talk more than just history. I want to talk about how we read history books. So, I'm going to use Alan Malay's seminal work, Semper Fidelis, A History of the Marine Corps War. If you don't have a copy, get one. It's an excellent work, both in terms of the depth and the writing ability. Imagine that, writing with a goal of writing well. Can't possibly imagine why anyone would want to focus on this. Anyway, something I want to focus on in addition to the history is how to read a history book. It's not just the one word at a time kind of reading. There are skills that you need to have if you want to be able to actually study history. The first is being able to determine whether or not the book is actually accurate. There's simply no way of doing this yourself other than by yourself chasing down all the sources and building a working knowledge of the subject. The only other plausible way is determining the accuracy is if someone or some organization you trust does that for you and puts their stamp of approval on the work. But this video isn't going to be about textual criticism because I'm not with stuff. So we're going to assume that A, we trust the source, and B, conclusions he draws from this source are valid. In Marine speak, ominous dominus. Okay, so onto how to read a history book. If you want to read a history book, you have to start with this one deceptively simple principle. The author is a human, writing about other humans for other humans. Books about dinosaurs are just another story. This means that we are dealing with normal human faults to the power of like 3. Anyway, because it's written by humans, about humans, for other humans, we have to deal with how humans think, what our blind spots are, what our spotlights, the opposite of a blind spot, are, and how we communicate this information. All these things are separated by what we are trying to get to, which is the truth. Capitalized, proper noun. It's very difficult, it's not impossible to get to the truth capitalized. And I'm not going to get into the philosophy of history in this video because honestly, I hate each and every one of the writers on the subject. Okay, so we probably will never get there, but we can kind of control how close we get. And that requires communication. One of the ways in which our brains are wired to communicate is with stories. Every history book is in some way trying to communicate a story to the reader. This might sound counterintuitive because we associate stories with fiction, but again, we are trying to communicate with people. At the very least, we want people to remember the raw data we are throwing at them, which means that we have to present this data in such a way that people will find it easy to remember. It's hard to remember just a random timeline of events where everything is kind of loosely connected than it is to remember a story of heroes, of villains, of twists and turns, of drama and pathos. Once you understand that history books are trying to tell a story, then you can be on the lookout for other things that you would expect in stories. You can be on the lookout for blind spots, the spin. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't enjoy the story for what it is. What it does mean is that you should judge a history book largely on 2 criteria: how much they sacrifice history for the story, how well they tell that story. Good history books won't sacrifice much for the story, and they will tell the story well. In other words, we are judging them by their ability to communicate truth, capitalized. Okay, enough about reading history. Now we're going to get into the actual history of the times people wanted to dissolve the Marine Corps. So let's finally get started. Okay, a treat. Archibald Henderson. Every Marine knows this guy. 39 years as Commandant, grand old man of the Marine Corps. If you have a history buff Marine, they might tell you that he led the Marines in both the Seminole Wars and the Mexican-American War. And maybe if he's really educated, he might tell a joke about how he tried to will the Commandant's house to his kid because he lived in it for so long that he forgot he didn't actually own it. What's criminally undertaught in boot camp, because this man was so much more than just 39 years as Commandant, grand old man of the Marine Corps. He was a political knife fighter. His number one strategy for winning was to just not stop fighting until his opponent literally just died. I'm not joking when I say this guy was criminally undertaught in boot camp. These are the things listed to just start the shenanigans he pulled. For instance, he not only created the Marine Corps band, but he rented them out like a bunch of cheap prostitutes to anyone and everyone who had any pull in Washington. He begged, he blackmailed, he badgered for more funds for the Marines, more pay, more equipment, more allowances, and managed to bump up their numbers. He fought to the death to keep any mission from being taken from the Marines, from ship guards to yard guards. He worked to gain allies in the naval establishment, such as Matthew C. Perry. Yes, Japan, Matthew C. Perry. It was a very small club in order to keep the Corps alive. This is relevant because in 1833, there were serious talks of dissolving the Marine Corps, and kind of worst of all, they kind of had a point, as there were a bunch of problems with the Marines. Okay, for starters, the Marines were double the cost of a similar similarly sized army regiment. This was primarily due to the geographic spread of the Corps, as they were split amongst multiple naval yards. There was one in Washington, there was one in Philadelphia, there was one in New York, and sea duty pay. Not helping matters was for the tendency of officers to double dip pay and allowances, which included Archibald Henderson. However, Marines survived due to Henderson, A, building a coalition of congressmen and naval officers, and B, outliving his enemies, like Andrew Jackson and the Naval Board of Commissioners. This was his favorite strat. So you would think that the Marines could breathe a little easy, right? Nope. Come the 1860s, and not only had Henderson, finally done his enemies a solid and died, they didn't exactly cover themselves in glory during the Civil War. They weren't completely awful. They did a bunch of amphibious landings. They helped out the Navy with their blockade. But everyone came out of the Civil War with one remarkable event, which was the Marines' performance in the First Battle of Manassas. Yeah, they didn't cover themselves in glory, and there's a reason that it's kind of an empty space in boot camp curriculum. The biggest reason for this is that there were only two actual warriors amongst the senior officers of the Marine Corps. Jacob Zeiland, the commandant and a veteran of Chapultepec, and Charles Macaulay, who was also a veteran of Chapultepec. The rest were, and I cannot stress enough, morons.
Let me put it this way. Have you ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes.
Morons.
Because when your country is busy tearing itself apart, the best thing to do is probably not use your political connections to avoid frontline service, and then use your ample free time to court-martial each other over slights. They didn't even have the balls to duel each other. Post-Civil War, this lack of public goodwill led to Congress starting to seriously consider dissolving the Marines due to the fact that it was billions of dollars in debt, and the Marine Corps didn't draw down because their contracts were based on years owed, the 4-year time in service, versus the Army's, which was for the duration of the conflict. It was only Zeiland doing what Henderson did, leaning on a coalition of congressmen and naval officers, that they barely managed to squeak by and not be dissolved. And even with that, their numbers were cut nearly in half, and their budget got cut even further. The establishment outside their coalition was not looking on them with a lot of grace. After all, the establishment was full of senior Army officers who had fought and died while senior Marines sat their fat asses in Navy yards. Zeiland and Macaulay had decided that they couldn't just rely on the politicking to keep the Marine Corps alive, so they began to lay the foundation of what would become the modern Marine Corps. If you ask me, we should be teaching more about Zeiland and Macaulay than we should about Archibald Henderson. So they purged the old officers. Like, these guys were in their 60s and their 70s. These were ancient, sinecure bastards. And they probably also had a bunch of help with establishment Army officer vets. They instilled various meritocratic reforms, such as standardized tests for commission, began to pull graduates from the Naval Academy, and then they began to focus training less on drill and more on marksmanship. This is also when they started adopting breech-loading rifles. So this brings us to the next time they tried to get rid of the Marines, which was in 1907 during the Roosevelt-Taft reorganization. At this point, Taft, I believe he was the Secretary of the Navy, as this is when the Marines were in a kind of superposition, where they were both incredibly vulnerable and at the same time incredibly secure. By this time, the reforms of Macaulay and Zeiland had entrenched themselves. The Marines had begun to clean up their image a bit. Before this, they were looked upon as sort of like the dregs of society. I mean, like, even more than now, where we kind of like good humor, those rascally Marines kind of in comparison. By this time, the Marines had begun to lean into using propaganda or PR or marketing or whatever you want to call it in order to build their popularity. But the PR and the newer meritocratic systems were not so well handled to be unassailable, leaving the Marine Corps vulnerable. Before, while their officers were mostly dog shit, they were also extremely well connected and politically savvy. You don't get to hold on to a sinecure unless you are a political knife fighter. Now, in 1907, they weren't. They had gotten rid of all those guys, which means they had gotten rid of a lot of their political cover. And more importantly, they lacked the combat record to really make up for it. This is not to say that the Marines weren't fighting between the Civil War and 1907. They absolutely were, with actions all going from Korea to Colombia. But they weren't as famous as they needed to be to fend off an attack from someone like Roosevelt, who was a savvy political operator. Fortunately, Roosevelt was his own worst enemy. He pissed off Congress on his own, and they only needed the barest of reasons to tell him to piss off, which the Corps happily provided. Now, we're reaching the scrimmage match of the most famous attempt. The post-World War I attempt was multifaceted. They either wanted to dissolve the Marines, or failing that, significantly reduce their mission and size. The Marine Corps managed to beat both of those attempts. Not only did they manage to stay as an organization, they managed to reinvent themselves. So they did cede some of their ships companies. They basically left all but the largest of the cruisers and began reinventing themselves as the Expeditionary Arm of the United States. This was a twofold approach. Number one, they would station themselves on far-off islands to protect naval supply depots.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
And number two, they would they would be the go-to force for enforcing the Monroe Doctrine in South America.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
And again, the Marines were saved by Congress, who was busy fighting the administration. And now, the most famous, the championship match. In this corner, we have the Army and the Air Force, one of which is soaking up more than half the defense budget. The other has the most famous officer the Army ever produced. And in this corner, we have a few colonels with a dream and General Vandergrift. Thankfully for the Marines, General Vandergrift was a political animal. In addition, thankfully for the Marines, we had stunning PR propaganda during the Second World War. Absolutely phenomenal. Blew it out of the water. Just no notes. Pure just peak propaganda. World War II. Not to say they didn't deserve it. The Second World War for the Marine Corps was a bunch of knife fightings in telephone booths. Okay, so back to how we read history books. History books are stories. They tell the story to convey information. Sometimes this information is the quote-unquote the moral of the story. And so what is this story that he's trying to tell us? What is the story that Alan Millay is trying to tell us? Well, number one, the Marine Corps is unique amongst the branches in that it must continuously justify its existence. The Corps can't just coast off its record. It tried that pre- and post-Civil War eras, and it almost lost those political fights. It was close. So the Corps always has to be ready to reinvent itself. It always has to be in control of the narrative that the country associates with it. So the Corps tries to stay nimble organizationally, while at the same time leans heavily into marketing or PR or propaganda or whatever you want to call it. Enlisted are the front face of the Marine Corps, and they must present the best possible image. If you've ever been in the Marine Corps, you know that if anything makes the Corps look bad, they will come on you like a ton of bricks. So in addition, as best as we can, the possible is also doing a lot of heavy lifting here. They have to be capable both for PR reasons and because of combat, which means that they have to be healthy, as a lot of the problems the Marines faced early on during the 1800s was because the enlisted were being overworked to sickness and disease. They must be paid. It was a genuine problem early on in the Marine Corps where a lot of Marines just straight up deserted or straight up enlisted into the deserted and enlisted in the Navy. Like they would literally just abandon in their post, show up at sometimes the same naval yard and enlist in the Navy because the Navy paid them more. And they had to look good. Again, the PR thing. Officers need to be leaders and above all warriors. They needed to be educated, young, and hardworking. The hardest time the Marine Corps ever had was when the officers were full of political animals who spent more time and effort avoiding sea duty than they were to be warriors. It was the hardest thing Henderson had to fight was his own officers. The only reason the Corps survived the 1800s is because it got lucky with Henderson, Zeilen, and Macaulay. And finally, the scariest question that could be asked of the Corps is that office space, what exactly do you do here?
What would you say you do here?
If anyone ever seriously asks that, that means the PR machine failed. And the Marine Corps will live and die by that PR machine. Wait, you might be asking, wasn't one of the points in the article that the Marines rely heavily on PR? And yes, it was. The Marine Corps leans heavily into PR because they see it as integral to their survival as an organization. Could other services do what the Marines do? Possibly. Would they be able to do it as well? Probably not, especially not anytime soon. Amphibious operations are something that's just hard to do, and it's not something you can just rush learning. If you get rid of the amphibious force in the Marine Corps, well, the Army and the Navy, they could pick up that slack. But how many decades are you willing to trash? Are you willing to just flush this capability away in order to save a few bucks? This is not the first time someone wanted to get rid of the Marine Corps. It won't be the last. As if we, as Marines, want our Corps to continue, it's incumbent on us to know how the Marines survived prior. We have a blueprint given to us by those who came before. The problem is that it's hidden in history books, and we are famously adverse to reading. And if you don't know how to read a history book, you won't be able to find these lessons, and you might not be able to save the Marine Corps the next time when it's not a journalist after clicks, but a president or a Congress that is looking to cut budgets.